we won't be able to develop the solutions of tomorrow without people.
Policy gives the framework, and then behaviour change ensures that that framework is adhered to. Absolutely fantastic facilities. They've got lasers and air jets and robot arms and AI.
Welcome to the Society of the Environment EnvCast, where we feature special guests highlighting an environment top 5 each month. Each month, we welcome 2 environmental professionals to explore what they believe to be the top 5 things to consider within a particular topic. Topics range from climate to leadership, agriculture to AI, and everything in between. Look out for some curveballs in the top 5 each month, and remember, we can't cover every important thing within a topic. Our aim is to uncover how you can be part of the solution, to learn from the experts, and to sometimes think outside of the box as we strive for a sustainable future. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to EnvCast for another Environment Top 5, this time focusing on the topic of influencing others, which could be seen as a vastly broad topic, but incredibly important when it comes to getting things done, bringing people along with you and moving the dial a little bit further. I'm Phil from the Society of the Environment and your podcast host for today. As always, I'll be having a good chat with 2 registered environmental professionals and exploring key topics from different perspectives to expand our collective knowledge and ultimately make more impact. To look into the top 5 things for professionals across sectors to consider in and around the topic of influencing others, we're joined by 2 chartered environmentalists today. Their biographies are in the podcast description, but as an extremely short introduction, I'm very pleased to be joined by Laura Mayhew-Manchón, who is a chartered environmentalist via their membership of the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals, or ISEP for short, very recently formerly IEMA. Laura is Head of Sustainability at Nottingham Trent University. I'm also joined by Cheryl Lee, who is a Chartered Environmentalist via the Institution of Environmental Sciences, or IES for short. But also, informed me just before the podcast, she's also a full chartered member of CIWM, which is the Chartered Institute of Waste Management. That's the one, Isn't it? Excellent. Cheryl is Senior Analyst at WRAP. So a very warm welcome to you both. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's get straight into the top 5. You'll notice that the formatting of the topics is slightly different this month, but as normal, we will be alternating between our chartered environmentalist guests, Laura and Cheryl, for the first 4. Then the final item is for them to agree as a top thing or a few top things to consider for influencing others, the key takeaway for our listeners. So number 1, I'm handing straight over to Laura to talk about influencing others through behaviour change and why it's important. But first, if you're able to tell us a little bit about yourself for a bit of context.
Thank you very much, Phil. Well, hi everyone. As Phil said, I'm Laura. I'm Head of Sustainability at NTU. As part of my role there, I am responsible for providing direction and accountability as part of our NTU Embracing Sustainability strategy and our net zero carbon targets. I facilitate collaborative action between our external and internal stakeholders to enable that. And my team, the sustainability team, and myself cover 6 different areas of operations and 6 different areas of support across all of our schools, across all of our 5 campuses. That includes strategy and leadership, net zero carbon, our environmental management system, travel and transport, ecology and wildlife, and last but not least, given today's topic, engagement and communication. Before my life at NTU, I carried out a different number of environmental roles and specialist roles across facilities management, construction, higher education, local government, and healthcare. So I've been a sustainability professional for over 20 years, and I've worked in private, public, and non-profit sector. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to be talking about the topic today. So, starting us off, what does it mean to influence others through behaviour change, and why is that important? I was giving this some good thought, and the first thing I thought we should discuss is actually what is behaviour change, because it might mean different things to different people. So for me, influencing others through behaviour change means encouraging or motivating people to modify their actions, their habits, or their ways of thinking in order to achieve a desired outcome or goal. And that's not just in terms of sustainability, that's just behaviour change in general. It's about creating an impact on someone's decisions or actions in a way that hopefully leads to a positive outcome, and it transforms how they act, they think, or they respond to certain situations. So bringing that into the sustainability lens, approaching behaviour change involves encouraging people to adopt habits or decisions that will essentially deliver positive environmental, social, and financial outcomes that are balanced. And this can be achieved through a number of different ways, and we're going to share some examples with you today. So starting off, education, that's one that will be familiar to most people in terms of how we influence behaviour change. That's providing information or insights and to help people understand why behaviour change is beneficial in the first place. Motivation, so inspiring people through rewards or positive outcomes, or actually linking personal benefit and showing how change aligns with their own values. That's quite significant too. Social influence, and that's something that obviously is taking off quite substantially in recent years, especially in the digital sphere. So using peer pressure or the power of social norms to encourage change. And as if one person adopts a certain behaviour, it's proven that others are more likely to feel compelled to adopt that behaviour themselves. There's something called environmental mods, which I don't know if everyone's come across, and that's actually altering the surroundings or the environment to make resources available that facilitate a certain behaviour. So that could be signage, it could be how the environment, and I'll go on to that later, affects us around us, but those modifications do actually trigger certain behaviours in us. Modelling, that's really important. So that's the walking the talk aspect. So if we see someone practicing a certain behaviour, we are more likely to adopt it ourselves. And all of these essentially come to show that behaviour change doesn't happen in isolation, and it requires a combination of psychological, emotional, and social factors to be effective. It's not about telling someone what to do. It's about showing them and guiding them to a place where they can see the value themselves in that change and helping them to embrace it. We'll come on to some of those examples in a little while. So to add to that, I just wanted to also share a reflection. I was thinking of why is it important to influence others in terms of behaviour change? And I thought of three things I wanted to share with you today. Firstly, research shows that as humans, our decisions and actions are actually driven by our beliefs, our attitudes, and our core values. So we need to be tapping into these and not ignoring them because they will make a difference in terms of our behaviours. Secondly, our actions, and I mentioned this in terms of the environmental mods, our actions are influenced by the behaviour and the environment that we're in, and in turn, our environment influences our actions. So we cannot afford to ignore the fact that we are part of the environment as humans and that they will build on one another. So how we interact with the environment and how the environment interacts with us also drives behaviour. And thirdly, our priorities and the resources that we enable to act on those and to make them happen, they are constantly in flux and they're changing, especially as we live in and work increasingly in what's called a VUCA world. That's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So as the world changes, we need to change with it. So agility and the capacity to evolve and change our behaviour and our approaches is also critical when there is flux. So for me, influencing behaviour change is really important to any sustainability strategy and action plan, regardless of whatever sector we're working in or whatever setting, because it will be a key success factor if we leverage it correctly, and it will enable change to stick in the long term. So for that, we need to bring stakeholders on board and gain their buy-in.
Interesting. There's a lot to unpack there already, which doesn't surprise me. There's a lot to it. It's not, like you said, it's not just telling people what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. This is very much an influencing game, obviously. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that the landscape of influencing is always changing. And a term that a lot of people will know of is influencers, for example. That's one option, I suppose, in terms of the influencing sphere. Is there a thing that is there a model that brings all those things together in a way? Are there models around that?
In terms of influence?
Yeah. You've mentioned quite a few things there. Are there influence models, diagrams and stuff that we could follow?
Absolutely. And yes, there is quite a lot of research in psychology that's gone into the psychology of change, but also in terms of from a business and as ESG has taken over in terms of the reinforcing factors within that. So we obviously know that sustainability is built on a trilemma. And in terms of the different models around behaviour change, there's quite a bit on that. In fact, when the podcast goes out, perhaps we could share some of those links, because I do have a few.
Okay, that could be really interesting. How much of a role does behaviour change, do you think, how much of a role does it have in an environmental professional's goals? Because environmental professionals can be pretty ambitious, it's fair to say, and in order to move the dial to make a bigger difference, how much of a role does behaviour change play in that? Can it play in that? I guess it will vary massively, but if we all want to get to a shared goal, I guess it's pretty important.
I would agree, Phil, absolutely. And of course, I can't speak for every environmentalist out there, but from my own experience and from working with peers and colleagues and friends, I would suggest that it is, as I said, we live in a VUCA world, and as environmentalists, we have to constantly evolve and constantly think of the paradigm shift and how will we resolve the solutions we have today won't work for the problems of tomorrow. So I would say behaviour change is critical as a tool actually in our toolkit as environmentalists, because we won't be able to develop the solutions of tomorrow without people. They will be people-centric, because at the end of the day, people are core to sustainability, both in terms of we are part of the problem, so we also need to be part of those solutions. And in terms of motivation is critical, not just in terms of stakeholders, but ourselves, as you say, in terms of us keeping the pace, because some of the areas of sustainability and some of the challenges that we face can be quite serious and, as we know, quite significant. And they do have an impact emotionally and mentally, as we know, from an eco-anxiety perspective, from many of the topics that are out there that we're talking about. But yes, I think behaviour change can and should be a driving force behind what we do as sustainability professionals and environmentalists.
Okay. Well, hopefully this podcast moves everyone a step closer to being more influential and moving things in the right direction. We shall see. Moving on to topic number 2. So following behaviour change, we move into policy. What does it mean to influence policymakers, and why is it important? So I'm going to hand over to Cheryl. But first, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself for a bit of context.
I am a senior analyst within BAP, and my role is to provide evidence to the government for their policymakers. The thing that I've learned over the few years of doing it is that they are time short, and they really require us to provide very succinct, very simple, basic evidence for decision making. They have 2 minutes to contemplate. Should we use one bin or two? Should local authorities collect food waste separately or with garden waste? What is the impact later on in infrastructure capacity? What impact does that have on households in the UK? That's where we step up. We use publicly available data. So I use data that is provided by facilities, reprocessing facilities. It's called waste data. They have waste that's incoming and waste that's outgoing. So we have a look at the quality of that data and the material itself, the quantity. We can then see the impact that these decisions have on the bigger picture, the broader scope. I think over the years, especially when I first came into this predominantly quantitative role, I often had the internal conversation, what is more important? Is it behaviour change or is it policy? I think what I've really determined throughout this time is that both are as important as each other. Policy gives the framework, and then behaviour change ensures that framework is adhered to. There's nuances in both, but it's a little bit like I went to a breakfast meeting once, and I heard a waste collector say, you use it and we'll treat it. And I heard the manufacturer say, you use it, we'll sell it, we'll produce it. And you've got the user say, well, you're selling it, so I'll use it. So who does it land with? Who should we actually take that decision making back to? And what policy can do is say, no one's going to buy it, sell it, no one's going to make it, and no one's going to use it. So therefore, we won't have that material to deal with at the end. Thing is, the unintended consequences there are an entire industry set up around that material. So any kind of policy needs to take into account the stakeholders right from the bottom all the way to the top and the circularity of it all. So it's a slow game. You can't just make decisions overnight. Although there were policies, the Chinese national sword, where we used to export a lot of plastic recycling. But when they did an audit, they found high quantities of contamination, way beyond they were accepting. And this was having a major impact on their environment, their ability to handle the copious amounts of waste coming into the country. So they closed their borders unless it was very strict levels of contamination that were accepted. But also we had a policy change in the UK where it was then thought, no, we need to bring that waste back closer to home. So this is about, we need to deal with it closer to home. And therefore it becomes more of a, not on their doorstep, on our doorstep. And as soon as you start seeing that impact, people start doing something about it. It instigates industrial change. It will impact entire markets. It changes the horizon and it influences what people do on the ground. So I think the most current example I could think of at the moment, where fast fashion, it's an issue. Everyone knows it's an issue, but people want clothing and the quality of the clothing is reducing in certain areas. The higher quality clothing is more expensive. Everyone is feeling the pinch. Jobs are being lost left, right, and centre. It's a strange market out there for people and for businesses. And so to rely solely on behaviour change in a situation where people want clothing and they want to stay up with fashion, and the younger generations coming through, sort of just seeing this, well, I want to wear that one top once, I can't be seen in it again kind of thing. Something needs to be done. Europe has just passed a policy for the textiles extended producer responsibility. Now that will have immeasurable impact on the quality of the material coming through, because producers, they're going to pay more per item. So it's in their benefit to produce items that last for longer, and then they can charge more for it. So actually it will have a real positive impact and it will slow down the fast fashion. Same with packaging in this country. We have a packaging EPR, so extended producer responsibility. That's now forcing the packaging producers to make packaging that is easier to recycle, that has less layers of material, that can then be used in producing more packaging. So it really is starting to close the loop. So I believe, there's very much a strong connection between behaviour change and policy. And that's from my perspective.
So two things in particular struck me from that is, well, for a start, you mentioned it as a slow game, but then you also mentioned that you have about 2 minutes of somebody's time at death row to get your point across, which is an incredibly fast game. And how do you do it? It really reminded me of the need to be seen, and it instantly made me think of interviews, when job interviews. You have, I don't know what the stat is, you have like 10 seconds or something to give your first impression. But I guess in terms of a consultation response or whatever you're trying to tell government officials, whatever it might be, you really have to. There's a big marketing element there, isn't there? To be able to get it across the line, to be able to be read fully for a start. So I wondered from that whether having the name wrap up there, you're already an influential body, and that helps. So that's another part of the influencing journey. Does that all make sense? Is that really true?
It does. And I think what brings with it from an organisation such as RAP is the trust that's been built up over the years. The methodologies that have been quality assured internally, externally, the peer review that goes behind providing these insights. So what lands on someone's desk is just a bar chart. It's nothing more than a bar chart, but presented from a business that has robust methodologies, and knowing that stakeholders have all been considered throughout this decision process and incorporated in that bar chart. But ultimately, if someone is making 15 decisions a day, they want to be able to look at it and go, well, it makes sense. Maybe, yes, to have someone on hand to ask questions, should they have questions. But the insights are really key. A picture paints 1,000 words, as they say.
All right. The second thing that really struck me was in terms of the dynamic with policymakers. So you mentioned about influencing those policymakers. So you've got an influencing part there to influence the policymakers, but then those policymakers will hopefully implement something, which is then going to drive behaviour change and influencing at the next stage. So I'm sure there's multiple points of that journey, but it really struck me that there's an influencing the influencer in a way. Can you call policymakers an influencer? You probably can. I guess so. I don't know why I wouldn't say that. Yeah. I just find that dynamic interesting. There's huge amounts of, there's varying the amounts of steps to get that influence to the right places to make as big a influence as possible. I'm getting myself in a
sometimes where policy stops, it instigates the influence in a market. So it can trigger markets and trigger industrial infrastructure to be built if new waste streams come through the system, for instance.
What a dynamic to be in. Could we come back to some of your examples in your topic number 4 and revisit some of those, because they were really interesting. But we're going to move on to topic number 3, which goes back to Laura. How do you achieve behaviour change in practice? Have you got some examples for us, Laura?
Yes, I'd love to share some. So, as I mentioned earlier, and as part of the conversation that we're having is coming quite clearly, that behaviour change, in order to be successful in the long run, there's a combination of different factors. Some of them are policy, some of them are psychological, some of them are social, some are environmental, and all of them need to be considered alongside each other. And the more that these factors are aligned, the greater the likelihood that the behaviour change will have long-lasting change and impact. And I'm going to share some examples. But before I do that, just to frame this, and also something that Cheryl mentioned, I do think it's important to remember how they are connected. So to give an example that isn't necessarily sustainable, although it does have social impacts and social sustainability does come into it, what we accept today from actually an ethical perspective might be very different to what is considered acceptable or not in 20 years' time. So fast fashion and also smoking. If we think of the smoking ban and smoking 20 years ago, that was a policy and health-driven campaign that then has led to in indoor spaces, smoking in the UK not being something that's neither legal nor socially acceptable. But if I think back to my youth, that was something that was considered a norm. So I'm just thinking in terms of it's important to frame behaviour change both now and in the future and to plan accordingly, because as you were saying, Cheryl, things change. And sometimes policy is ahead of the behaviours and sometimes they're influenced by the behaviours and vice versa. So just 2 examples there of how these things change over time. And sometimes, as you said, Phil, sometimes it's in short periods of time. Sometimes actually it's much longer term. So just to give some examples of both the factors and actually how those look like in practice from a sustainability perspective. The first aspect, clarity of desired behaviour. So when we want behaviours to change, we really need to be clear of what we're trying to ask of others and why. So, for example, saying we want you to be more sustainable is not going to really land true to many people or encourage much action, but bring a reusable bag when shopping. That's been something that's changed behaviour very clearly, or giving them at the supermarket, or becoming net zero carbon by a certain date across a certain scope of emissions. Those tangential points, being able to quantify and clarify and communicate that clearly to others really does make a big difference. And we've seen that across, as I say, the net zero carbon agenda as something that's been able to capture people's attention because it's quantifiable it's a currency and a metric that's common to most sectors. And it's also something that we can see a greater goal in terms of its impact on climate change. Another one being the social norms and peer influence, as we were talking about. So highlighting that most people are doing it. So again, 20 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, we might have not seen people wearing active wear to work. But now that we are cycling, walking and using other transport means to work, including, for example, at Nottingham Trent University, and I'm sure the organisations, we have lots of different active travel and transport options for our students and our staff and our wider visitors. And that's also changing not just how we move and where we move, but what we wear as part of that. And in a changing climate, that also changes with the seasons. So that's just also something in terms of those examples. And I've got 2 examples I'd like to share with you about how we engage and make behaviour change personal. I think that's really important in terms of making it relevant to the stakeholders, and they can be very different from very different backgrounds and walks of life and lived experiences. So it's really important to, when designing behaviour change actions and programs, thinking of the diversity of the different people involved, and therefore tailoring the behaviours to make sure that they take that into consideration. So as an example, here at Nottingham Trent University, we are part of the Climate Ambassador Scheme of the East Midlands, which we co-host with University of Nottingham under the Universities for Nottingham Civic Agreement. And it's a programme whereby, funded by the Department for Education, whereby we provide free expert guidance to educational institutions, including nurseries, schools and colleges, to help them create and implement their own climate action plans in their bespoke setting. There are 8 other hubs like ours across the UK, and we're working together to essentially enhance sustainability in education and prepare young people for a changing climate. Now, given that there is lots of research pointing towards our blueprint of our own core values and our moral compasses starting as early as 7 years old, it's really important that when we talk about behaviour change, that we don't just think about adult behaviour change, because a lot of the behaviours we're trying to change start in young people. So it's really important that we bring early years into the equation too. And to date, collectively across the UK in this scheme, we've helped to support over 1,000 institutions and all the different young people within them. So that's just one example that also ties into the aspects of making it personal, making it relevant, and also leading by example. Because again, if the teachers and the governors and the different and the parents even are showing and demonstrating sustainable behaviours, the children will also pick them up. Although quite often the children are the ones leading the way. So it's also important to bring them into the equation. And earlier we've both mentioned actually the importance of incentives and rewards, I think, and actually the fact that it's important to motivate people into behaviour change rather than driving it from a negative point. In fact, fun is often more of a motivator than fear in behaviour change. So in terms of programs and actions, be them policy driven or be them organic in their own setting, it's really important to reward positive behaviours. One way that we're doing that here at NTU is through our Green Rewards programme. So it does what it says in the tin. We essentially encourage sustainable actions amongst our staff and students through both our online and our mobile app platform. That was launched in 2019, and that's enabled 5,000 unique sign-ins. So that's different users going in to take 68,000 actions across lots of different areas of sustainability, from waste, travel and transport, water, energy. And that's resulted in 65,000 kilowatts of energy being cut, 24,000 kilograms of waste being recycled, and 54,000 active miles travelled. And that's saved over £50,000. So that is important, not just because, and also as part of that, I should say, it's important not just because of the local sustainability impacts that has, but also from an individual aspect. The users of Green Rewards get rewarded through different vouchers, different point schemes. They can use that in local retailers, in sustainable purchasing. And that has been amplified because that platform, Green Rewards, is also now open to be used by local authorities and other universities. So again, the aspects, we've seen that in non-sustainability related spheres like Duolingo, there is more and more coming down the line in terms of gamification. So making it accessible, making it fun is another really key way and successful way to drive behaviour change that sticks amongst individuals.
I was frantically writing notes down there. There was a lot to unpack.
I thought you might be able to use it at the top or at the bottom as you saw best.
It's true, yeah. I really liked that, your colleague coming into the office in full lycra having cycled to work is, they're trendsetters. I like that. Why shouldn't they be trendsetters? And it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's a CEO or whoever it might be, but they're showing the way, and they start to influence and make a difference, don't they? That work with the Climate Ambassador Scheme sounds fantastic. I don't have anything else to say about it, but it sounds great. Can we know more? Maybe not in the podcast, but I'd like to know more.
Absolutely. And the ambassadors themselves are volunteers. So anyone that has an interest in sustainability and some knowledge to give from any sector, any industry is really welcome to register as an ambassador. So we can share some details when the podcast goes out, because we would like to recruit some more.
Interesting. I'm now a school governor, very recently school governor. So I'm intrigued about how these things filter through to the education system, and what kind of influence it can have. And clearly, I'm aware that the education system can have a lot of influence. I really enjoyed the fact you gave lots of facts, said something about £50,000 saved and kilowatt hours and so on. And I guess what struck me was the different parts of that different people will pick up as good and will start to influence them, because I think you mentioned £50,000 saving as the last thing, as like a small little thing. But clearly finance drives a lot of behavior change in business, because it's clearly there's a financial focus on making profit and so on. But if you're able to articulate that in certain ways, the influence can help with that. Some other people will be interested in the kilowatt hours, but I guess it's trying to match the different audiences of who's going to be influenced with what bits, without being too overawed with huge amounts of stats, I suppose. But just another thing that caught my attention. Right. So, number 4, we're going back to policy. So how do we effectively influence policymakers in practice? And Cheryl, I think you mentioned a few of the examples already, such as fast fashion, plastic recycling, EDR. Is that right? Is that the right acronym?
EPR.
Oh my God, I got it wrong, didn't I? EPR. That's why I'm scribbling too fast. I can't read my own writing. But if you're able to give us some of those examples with a bit more detail, maybe, and how policy influencing has affected it.
Yeah, sure. So I was going to talk about the simpler recycling regulations that have come in recently. Okay. Its main aim is to standardise recycling across England, both from households and from businesses. And to link into what you were saying, Laura, when you're looking at, influencing an entire population, they are looking for ease of use. It's got to be easy. For householders to recycle, it has to be that bin or that bin. What becomes more complicated is when you're dealing with a plethora of different materials. Can that plastic be recycled or that one? I'm not sure. Until recently, plastic bottles were the norm, but simpler recycling have increased the number of core materials that need to be collected to include pots, tubs and trays, foil, aerosols and cartons, and that's alongside the paper and cardboard, glass, plastic bottles and cans. So the key 3 dates for simpler recycling are this year. Businesses with 10 people or more have to recycle those same materials and provide a food waste collection as well from their properties. Next year, local authorities will kick in, so all of them have to provide collections for all of those materials, as well as food waste from every household in the country. And then from 2027, the smaller businesses, we call them micro, so 9 people or below, will need to do the same. And also, all households and all businesses will need to collect flexible plastics for recycling. As you can imagine, that is quite some policy to implement. It involves every single person in the country, every single local authority, all the different stakeholders. The reason I was going to use it is because there are so many people that it influences and requires behaviour change throughout. And we were talking about unintended consequences before. So one of the policy options within that was, should we put all of our recyclables in one bin, or should we put them into two or more? So the predominant collection, curbside collection that households have are either what we call a commingled collection, so all your dry recyclables in one. They then get taken off to a material recovery facility, and then they're separated out. Absolutely fantastic facilities. They've got lasers and air jets and robot arms and AI. Very cool, very fancy. But not all of them are as modern as others, and some can't accept certain materials. And there's going to be legacy contracts with local authorities and their waste collectors and processing facilities that will really dictate how materials are collected. So I was asked to provide some evidence. What is the impact of collecting all of the waste in one bin versus collecting it in two? So we'd have one stream separate, let's say for fibres. So we'll put all of the recycling into one bin other than paper and cardboard. Because paper and cardboard are collected separately, that will go straight to a reprocessor. So it doesn't need to go via a MRF. That clearly relieves the MRF capacity if we do something like that. And it will have an impact on the quality of the material coming through the MRFs. MRFs do a fantastic job, don't get me wrong, but some materials can contaminate other materials if they're co-collected. You've got your downstream industries that, of course, would like all of their materials collected separately. So we're kind of now balancing the paper industry, the glass industry, the plastics industry. They all want separate collections, but what can we do to satisfy a service that that householder can use versus a local authority that needs to collect this material, pass on to any kind of facility that separates it, and then sells it on to the industry that will then use it in their processes. And so that was one part of the influence and insights that I provided government. The second part was to actually look at, well, what is the impact on the infrastructure? Can the MRFs in the country handle all that waste? We're not just talking household waste here, because yes, they can if it were just household waste. But actually what we're talking about are all other businesses, especially those that are producing household-like waste. So you've got your bigger businesses that predominantly are already recycling. Maybe some aren't, but there is a good standard of recycling already coming through. But your micros, although they're very small and you'd think individually the impact's going to be quite small, when you take into account them as a total, that's an awful lot of waste to start coming through a system where maybe they haven't been coming through before. So I then did some analysis on the capacity of MRFs in the country, where they're located. We did it by region. We had a look at business numbers. You're looking at predominant waste streams coming from those specific businesses and the size of the businesses. And then you're trying to calculate the capacity coming through, the amount of waste that we will predict will come through. And so that then falls back to the original question, one bin or two. So it's quite a lot of work that comes into producing that insight to ensure that we're talking to everyone and getting their perspective as well, to make sure we represent everyone within that decision-making process.
Wow. I don't know if this hit home with you as well, Laura, but that sounds like what a massive challenge that is, to simplify the whole waste recycling system. It's so complicated. I mean, I'm not in the industry, but people, my family expect me to know what's going on with what to put in recycling and so on, because I work for the Society for the Environment. But if I'm honest, sometimes I haven't got a clue, because it's so different. And when people are in different counties and have different bin collections and they collect different things, how do you standardize that? I don't know. But then, people like you are doing the influencing to make it better, which is that's needed. I think it's needed because it's confusing.
Yeah. And the whole purpose is to take away the confusion. So when people are in their home, you'll get your purposeful contaminators. So they'll be putting their residual waste in the recycling bin, therefore contaminating that. But more often than not, it's the wish cyclers. Well, I was on holiday and I can recycle pots, tubs and trays at home, so I must be able to where I'm in my holiday destination. It's that kind of behaviour, or, well, I don't know what to do with it, best recycle it just in case. That's where there are issues. And if everyone did that, the quality of the material really does sink. There's some other elements as well. The extended producer responsibility has been implemented all around packaging. So that means the producers of packaging are paying a fee, which is going back to local authorities. So they are paying for the collection and treatment of the packaging that they're producing. So actually, local authorities have to prove that they are doing their best to collect that packaging, to be able to recycle it, to give it back to the industry, to reuse it, to close that loop. And so the behaviour in the household becomes more paramount. And so having that service that is easy to use becomes even more important.
Yeah, sounds like it. So there's so much to consider. And it made me think about part of the big challenge was, Laura, you mentioned school to influencing the education system essentially. But then when things change so often, it's quite tricky to keep up and re-influence and make sure people are up to speed throughout the school life and well beyond. So very interesting. Sounds like more of a challenge than there's no quick win there, is there? Or is there?
No. Multi-pronged attack, I think.
Multi-pronged attack. Yeah. Makes sense.
I commend your efforts and those of your colleagues, Cheryl, because the scale of the challenge needs to be met by the scale of the ambition. And I think simpler recycling is the first, in my personal opinion, the first important stab at this that has the hope of being able to get us where we need to be from a UK-wide consistent approach. And that's what's needed. So, as I say, it won't, as you were saying, Phil, it won't be tomorrow, but we need to go on that journey, and we've needed that for a while. So onwards, and great to see that it is already moving in the right direction.
Now, interestingly, the plan is for our next podcast episode is going to be focused on waste. So we may well have to link some things across, and maybe we could pose some questions to our guests at that point, and I could have a chat with Cheryl to figure out what direction that discussion could go in, because clearly the whole waste environment is vast anyway. When we talk about contaminated waste and hazardous and household and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, staying with this episode, the final item. So topic number 5. What's the biggest takeaway you want listeners to be considering? What are your top tips and advice for influencing others? Who wants to start?
So for me, 3 top tips, and that's from learned experience. Make it personal. We've already spoken about that, but behaviour change is more likely to be sticking and for people to buy into it if it's personally meaningful to them. That would be, as you said, there's different currencies of how that's measured. So it's also really important to know what the stakeholders are going to react to. Health, cost savings, convenience, moral values, all of that's important. It's also really important when we make it personal to not just assume that we know. So as you were saying, Cheryl, it's important to bring everyone in, and for it to be equitable and inclusive behaviour change, we also need to understand that stakeholders' needs and wants change over time. So asking them what matters to them via surveys, focus groups, tailoring the messages around the responses. So it's really important to connect to people's values and to therefore make that behaviour change personal and be influenced by them in making it from the beginning. So make it personal. Never wasting a crisis. This might be a bit of a controversial one, but I've learned that there's something here. So people are more open to change and be more receptive to that change when they're going through different transitions. So it doesn't have to be a global crisis like climate change, but we did learn from COVID that actually in times of transition, as a result of COVID and all of obviously the challenges it brought and all of that, we did, however, become more normalized in terms of hybrid working. It became more commonplace and acceptable. So never waste a crisis for me is about ensuring that habits are brought in when they've already been disrupted. So creating windows of opportunity when there's already change afoot. That could be moving premises, starting a new strategic cycle or a new financial or academic year, when there's a restructure within an organization. So not waiting to start a change, but actually sometimes change begets change. So making change happen when change is already there. And the top one for me, I would say, as environmentalists, we need to lead by example, and everyone can be a leader in terms of the steps that they take. So being visible, being communicative, and also not shying away from when things don't work when it comes to behaviour change. So also, what are the challenges, not just the benefits to reap? So a way of doing that is getting board level champions to actually use their platform to promote behaviour change, getting testimonials from different people that different stakeholders might. It doesn't have to be necessarily a celebrity. It could be a celebrity in your own locality or your own setting or sector. And also making different people be represented in different behaviour change efforts, such as campaigns or workshops. Just making sure that peers are visible and that the behaviours that we want people adopting are seen to basically gain approval and boost that credibility aspect. And I think you talked to that earlier, Phil. So I don't always get it perfect, even as head of sustainability, absolutely not. But I try and be open and transparent about that, and also to lead by example. I don't wear lycra to the office, but I do sometimes wear my trainers. So
good.
For me, taking that leadership role is also really important.
Cheryl, what inputs would you have in this?
I think it is. If you're influencing government or policymakers, you have to produce robust work. It has to be quality assured. You need to use reputable sources. You need to triangulate your data. You need to have both peer review, stakeholder input. It just altogether has to be trustworthy, and you need to know it inside and out, be able to answer questions on it like a drop of a hat. And I think that is key, is to know your stuff and to do a proper job.
Sounds like a big tick for credibility.
Yeah.
And as a chartered environmentalist, hopefully that sings through in your work, and the fact that you've been peer reviewed to be chartered in that way, which brings a level of trust and credibility and so on. And clearly you've demonstrated that to be able to become chartered. So hopefully that all adds together. A term that came to mind, which is the opposite of what you're saying, is essentially you want to kind of crash through the fake news situation that's a global issue at the moment. I did think I'd put greenwashing down as well, because the credibility element, it all needs to be trustworthy to bring everyone along with you, right? And fake news and greenwashing doesn't do that, it's fair to say. I was thinking of the negative end of the scale, I suppose. Okay, so there's some top tips for everyone to think about. So that brings us to a conclusion for this month's podcast. So thank you to our guests today. We've covered a lot. If you, the listener, have ideas of what could have been in the influencing others top 5, let us know in the YouTube comments. We're keen to keep the conversation going. Can you leave comments on Spotify and others? Something for us to think about, not sure. And finally, please check out any links and resources in the podcast description to keep on learning. So thank you again to Laura and Cheryl, and I will see you in the next episode next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you've made it this far, please remember to subscribe wherever you're listening to this episode so you don't miss the next one. Also, rate our podcast and leave a comment to help us reach more people. Thank you very much for listening or watching on YouTube. We look forward to the next episode next month. See you then.